which will debrief you on our meeting today and on the results of this meeting. President, over to you.
Do I need to put the microphone? Good evening from Lisbon. Today we answered the call from our citizens for Europe that protects. It took us a total 16.5 hours of meetings and many more in preparations, but we did it. I reconvened the Eurogroup today, together with non-Euro area finance ministers, to conclude our work on a comprehensive economic policy response on the COVID-19 outbreak. I will also send a letter to the President of the European Council reflecting all the proposals that have been made and which informed our agreement today. This response contains bold and ambitious proposals that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. We can all remember the response to the financial crisis of the last decade, when Europe did too little, too late. This time around is different. We have already seen a rapid, massive, coordinated impulse from the monetary and fiscal authorities and from regulators. Nearly 3% of GDP of fiscal measures, enhanced flexibility, additional liquidity schemes of 16% of GDP. Every time we meet, the numbers go up. If we combine these numbers, we will have to start talking in trillions of euros. That was our first line of defense emerging at national level. And now we are building European solutions, also in record time, because we will only come through this test together as Europeans. Going into the crisis, our nation's capacity to respond was different. We are not all at the same level, despite all the flexibility. It can become much worse on the way out of the crisis. That is why solidarity is key if we are to stop deep fragmentation in the euro area. Today, we tackle this risk. I want to focus on 3 safety nets we are weaving together. One for workers, one for businesses, and another one for countries. Let me first talk about workers and the self-employed. We have created 13 million jobs since the last crisis. This took many years of hard work. Many have been destroyed in only a few weeks. We need an additional layer of EU protection to ensure many more will not be lost in the future. Currently, we rely solely on the safety nets that are in place in each member state. These take many forms: schemes to support short-time work, unemployment benefits, and many other schemes. But these safety nets are facing unprecedented pressure in some parts of our Union. That is why we welcome the creation of a temporary European instrument to support national safety nets in this crisis, what the Commission has called SURE. This will put together our collective financial strength at the national and European levels to channel up to 100 billion euros to the national systems facing the greatest pressures. This will now be taken forward and fine-tuned in the legislative process. The second safety net is for businesses facing difficulties, in particular SMEs. Across the world, travel has been curtailed. Daily life has been put on hold and workers have stayed at home. This may stop transmission of the virus, but it also stops transmission of many goods and services. From the start, we have been putting together national schemes to give viable firms the liquidity they need to make it through this difficult period. And at the European level, the state aid rules have been adjusted. But some national schemes are more advanced than others and are backed by greater financial firepower. Our single market needs a level playing field, and leaders asked us to see how to scale up the actions of the European Investment Bank. This is why today we have welcomed the initiative of the EIB to create a pan-European shield which aims to guarantee 200 billion euros of lending with a focus on small and medium enterprises. Again, this scheme is based on our collective financial strength at the national and European levels. Because we are stronger, that is the safety net for firms. Finally, the safety net for member states. Today, we agreed to establish pandemic crisis support for the amount of 2% of member states' GDP. That is close to 240 billion euros. This is an important safeguard for all euro area countries during these times of crisis. It will be available to all ESM members with standardized terms on the basis of an upfront assessment by the European institutions. Any euro area country requesting this support remains subject to the EU's economic and fiscal coordination and surveillance frameworks. The only requirement to access the credit line will be that the country would commit to the use of these funds to support domestic financing of direct and indirect healthcare, cure and prevention-related costs due to the COVID-19. I should add that, in my interpretation as President, an average country affected by this crisis should be able to identify healthcare, cure and prevention-related expenditures of 2% of their GDP. This agreement shows we have the political will and flexibility to take the instruments we created during the last crisis, in this case the ESM, and make them relevant and appropriate for the current crisis. We would strive to make this pandemic crisis support operational within 2 weeks. Those were the 3 new European Union safety nets I wanted to talk about today. They add up to around €500 billion, a step change in the economic coordination within our Union. This emergency plan will shield our economic and social fabric as we dive into a recession. When the health crisis abates, we will need to spur the economic recovery. It is imperative that we grow together and not apart, and that we protect the internal market in doing so. Now is the right time to start this discussion. Far-sighted leaders plan for peace before the fight is over. That is why today we have discussed the next steps. The next EU budget will be a key component of this strategy. But today we also agreed to work on a recovery fund, which would turbocharge the European investments that we will need to build a better, greener, more resilient and more digital economy. As with the 3 safety nets, this fund would pool our financial strength to accelerate the investments we need. This fund would be temporary, targeted, and commensurate with the extraordinary costs of the current crisis and help spread them over time through appropriate financing. Subject to guidance from leaders, discussions on legal, practical and financial aspects will prepare the ground for a decision. Some member states expressed the view that this should be achieved via common debt issuance. Other member states said that alternative ways should be found. Let me wrap up. Today, we agreed 3 safety nets and a plan for the recovery to ensure we grow together and not apart once the virus is behind us. I will report to leaders on our achievements. All these build on our collective financial strength and our European solidarity. The numbers and quality of the proposals we take to the European Council reveal that, in the face of a tremendous threat to our lives and institutions, we are ready to bury our differences. At the end of the day, or should I say, at the end of the third day, an appropriate number for the season, what matters the most is that we rose to the challenge. Our citizens expect and deserve nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I pass on to the Commissioner, just a second. Hello? Yes. Hello?
Good evening from Brussels. And first of all, let me, on behalf of the Commission, thank Mario Centeno for your really relentless more than 20 hours, in fact, these 2 different days. I think that we have an agreement response that Europe needs. Implements a strong monetary policy response that the ECB is already implementing. We are doing this, as you say, Mario, with an unprecedented package of coordinated fiscal policy. The Commission had already taken significant decisions in these directions, allowing member states to use our funds in a flexible way, extremely flexible way, adapting our state aid rules, suspending with the general escape clause the Stability and Growth Pact. And the Council supported these measures. 1 week ago, we made another ambitious proposal, unlocking 100 billion in support to preserve jobs. And I'm particularly pleased that today we reached the agreement to support this proposal, and member states will strive to make it operational with their liquidity guarantee support as soon as possible. There is no time to lose on the jobs as we are seeing. So, for example, in the United States, where 10 American workers lost their jobs in the last 3 weeks. I also welcome the other 2 measures that Mario presented to us. The initiative of the European Investment Bank Group with this 200 billion in financing for companies focused on SMEs, and the pandemic crisis support to be made available from the ESM. I think on this we reached a very good agreement concentrating on healthcare costs, and we will also have other tools of safety for non-euro area countries using the balance of payment facility. These 3 pillars will be joined by a 4th pillar, which is the commitment to work for this recovery fund. I think this gives us the scale of the intervention which will be necessary to relaunch our economy. The design of this fund will need to be discussed, as Mario said, based on the guidance from the European Council. But something I think is already very clear, this fund will be used to address the challenge of relaunching our economy the next period, avoiding divergence. This is a symmetric crisis, and the recovery will mitigate the risk of having asymmetric consequences. These asymmetric consequences will be a danger for our union. This recovery plan, a central role will be played by a revised proposal for the next budget of the union. The situation Europe faces has changed beyond recognition since the last round of budgetary negotiations at the European Council. We will need a powerful, flexible EU budget for the coming years. We will need agreement to that end very will present our proposal at the end of. In conclusion, this is for sure not the end of the road. Thousands of European citizens are still fighting for their lives, and also in this occasion I will thank the workers that are helping them save their lives. We have much hard work still before us. Our time still lie ahead of all Europe. But tonight, Europe has shown it can deliver when the will is there. Now we must quickly take forward each of these strands of work so that together we can deliver the common and coordinated response you will. Thank you.
I didn't hear you. Do you hear me? Okay. Good evening from Luxembourg. I'm very happy that a good agreement was reached tonight. And I also want to congratulate the chairman of the Eurogrupo, Mario Centeno, for achieving this positive result. We know we are in a deep crisis. There are first signs of the deceleration of new infections on the health side. And we all know that the coronavirus can be brought under control quickly. But the social and economic consequences of the pandemic are very serious and will be with us for many years to come. It is therefore important that significant measures are taken at the national level and at the European level to mitigate these negative economic and social consequences of the virus. As you know, the first line of defense are the national measures. They are taken in every country of the European Union, but they depend on each country's particular circumstances. And this can lead to an asymmetry, as the Commissioner also just mentioned. And such an asymmetry would risk that divergences in Europe are growing. And that is a concern because such growing divergences would lead to fragmentation of the single market and of the euro area. Therefore, I think it's really important that the measures of the European Investment Bank, the European Commission, and CSM are designed to benefit more those countries that suffer more from the crisis, that are not able to finance national responses to the same extent as others. As fragmentation and to restore the level playing field. Let me turn on how the ESM will contribute to the joint European response. And as the chairman said, the ESM is the safety net for countries, just as the EIB is the safety net for corporates, companies, and is the safety net for unemployed people. The ESM will provide what we call pandemic crisis support. That support is based on our precautionary credit line called CCL, an instrument in the ESM's toolbox, never used before, but well suited to address the current problems in the corona crisis. In principle, it will be available for all euro area countries on the basis of standardized terms agreed in advance. Our credit line will provide liquidity at very low interest rates as countries can benefit from the ESM's very strong credit rating. The member state that draws under the CCL would commit to using the money to cover only corona-related costs. Each member state could benefit from the support with a benchmark amount of 2% of GDP. We can make the pandemic crisis support available within 2 weeks if the upcoming summit of the leaders so decides, and after national procedures and constitutional requirements have been followed. Thank you.
Thanks very much for all your statements. I'd just like to say before passing on the floor to journalists that the deliverable of this meeting is a report that was agreed by the Eurogroup, a report to the European Council, which is, if my information is correct, published or just about to be published. There will also be a cover letter by President Centeno to President Michel, which will be published later on. And now I take your questions. The first I have here is Sam Fleming from the Financial Times. Sam?
Thank you very much for taking the question. The question is for the Commissioner and the President. On the recovery fund, what is the process and timing from here in terms of how soon this recovery fund should be launched? How large do you believe the recovery fund needs to be in order to relaunch the post-crisis economy? I wondered also if you could talk a bit about the appetite amongst ministers to frame this fund within the MFF. Should this fund be within the MFF, or could the fund actually be outside the EU budget?
Well, thank you. Thank you for a question. The Eurogroup today agreed that we need to work not only on the short term, but also on the medium term. So we agreed that we need to prepare the ground for a recovery plan. All ministers agreed that we will need to design something new. And I saw indeed broad support for the setting up of this recovery fund. And this recovery fund is intended to provide additional funding via the EU budget. On size and on timing, we now seek guidance from the European Council. There are different options to set up this fund. We need to discuss the appropriate financing of it, but indeed this guidance is going to be crucial. This is going to be a very deep and temporary crisis, but the deepness and the size of the crisis will depend on the duration of the lockdown. We have to now focus ourselves in fighting the virus and protecting our economy, and as soon as we start recovery, we will be able to determine the size needed for this fund, and it must be available as soon as we start the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. So nenext question is Alex Pigman from Agence France Presse. Alex?
If I may only add something from our side, I think that for sure this fund should be connected with the EU budget. This is one of the issues that the Council will discuss, and President von der Leyen will include in our proposal on the new budget at the end of this month. It will be a sizable fund, and we have to find the best way to connect it to the new EU budget.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can't hear you, sorry.
Okay, sorry. All right, can you hear me? That's okay.
Yes, we can hear you now. Please, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Sorry, everyone. No, just really quickly, I was just wondering how ready are the countries that are supporting, and this is a question for President Centeno, how ready are the countries that are supporting the idea of pooled debt to have a major debate about that? Because for the countries that are against it, it's a pretty deeply held opposition that they have, and even Chancellor Merkel today said, you know, if we want to talk about this, then we need to be talking about a lot of other things, a lot of, you know, profound issues about the European Union, the treaties, and all the rest of it. I was just wondering, are the countries that are for the pool instruments, are they ready for that type of conversation, or are we not talking about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's interesting that the first two questions were about the future and not focusing on what we decided today. We decided to pool €500 billion into responding immediately to this crisis. It's very important to be focused on that. But of course, to answer your question, we need to. Can I go on? Okay. Sorry, there was here some doubts about the connection, so I'll continue. We will have this debate under the guidance of the European Council. I think it is important to listen from leaders on how to operate in this respect. But I've been president of the Eurogrupo almost for 2.5 years now, and I think this week we observed probably the greatest accumulation ever of what we call social capital in Europe. This is a sort of capital that we accumulate when we use it, and I am very proud to be present at this very historic moment and share this moment with the 350 million Europeans. What we will see in the future, if I can tackle again your question, will be not short of this accumulation of social capital that leadership and citizens now have to put into fighting this crisis. Again, I will prefer to focus on what we decided today. But we must be confident that in the future we will respond again.
Thank you. Next question, David Carreta. David? Could you repeat?
Yes. David Carreta. Thank you very much for this conference. I would have two questions. The first one on the package today, on the ESM. Would this credit line be an instrument to access to the OMT by the ECB? Do you think that there could be a solution or a help for member states, because 2% of GDP is not much according to different estimates for countries? And the second question to President Centeno and Mr. Regling, what type of conditionality do you foresee after the health and economic crisis? Will countries be requested to respect the general framework of economic governance? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. On OMTs, I will not comment on that. OMT is a decision for the ECB. We are now witnessing the effectiveness of the response of the ECB, a very powerful response 3 weeks ago. I think this is a matter for the ECB. We think it's very important to understand that all institutions in Europe have their own. Each institution has its own role, and the ECB is certainly, under its independence, playing a very important role in this crisis. The conditionality associated with this credit line is COVID exclusively. Countries are the only requirement they have is to spend this money in health-related expenditures in cure and prevention. I estimate that each country can have, through the crisis, use 2% of its GDP in this credit line if they are to have access to it. What we expect of all countries afterwards is for them to make all efforts, but this is for all euro area countries, to return to a path of sustainability. This is both economic and financial. And if we are facing a temporary, symmetric, totally exogenous crisis, there is no reason for us to doubt that the previous path that we all were following will be taken again and countries to follow that. Thank you.
Klaus, do you want to add something?
No, I think
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Oh, hi. Sorry, it's just a bit of a follow-up, just to be sure, because it seems to me at least that the money that the ESM credit line loans can be used for, the scope seems a bit more narrow to me, and I'm just wondering if you could clarify. Will this be able to go just on health-related costs explicitly, you mentioned cure and prevention, or will it be able to be used for indirect costs in the form of, helping the economy because of the lockdown? So will it just be medical-related costs that this money can go to?
This money can go to direct and indirect costs, health-related with the COVID crisis. So it is not that narrow definition, but again, let me say that this is a financially meaningful instrument, and as President, I expect all countries throughout this crisis to be able, if they need to have access to this credit line, to have access to an amount that will be 2% of their GDP. But this is an insurance mechanism. This is a backstop. We buy insurance to be protected. This is what all these three backstops that we decided today are meant for, and if they are to be used, they will be put to serve those countries that in that situation may need it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, Maria Psara.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, two questions I made. First, will this ambitious package be enough to tackle the crisis? It has said that the money that will be needed are 1.5 trillion. Do you share this opinion? And some ministers say that corona bonds are still on the table. Are they?
Okay. Well, this is a crisis that has unprecedented size, and it was totally unexpected. The size of resources that we have to devote to this crisis will be mobilized as it unfolds. My opinion is that what we did so far is also unprecedented. 3% of fiscal measures in terms of GDP, plus more than 15%, 16% in terms of liquidity. The package we approved today is of a size close to 4% of European GDP, plus the automatic stabilizers that are quite powerful to protect European economies in case of crisis. This is totally unprecedented. We never ever reacted so quickly to a crisis as this one. Will it be enough? Well, we need to now fight the virus, start reacting in terms of reopening our economies as it is possible. We need to be very careful in doing so, and then we can start rebuilding, recovering from this, and all resources will be brought to this to respond to the crisis. This is my firm conviction. Thank you.
We have two more questions. Pascal Hansens from Agence Europe.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, it's a question which is rather more specific for Europe. I wanted to know if the scope is the same as initially proposed by the European Commission, and also I wanted to know how long will it take to the operational and how many countries might need that?
The primary scope of SURE will be to protect jobs and workers. This is our backstop for workers and for self-employed in Europe. This is the primary goal and scope for SURE. We commit to implement this as soon as possible. It will enter very, very soon into the legislative process, and the commitment of all countries is to implement it very fast. But maybe the Commissioner can say something on this.
Commissioner, do you want to step in?
Two things. One, we are satisfied with the fact that the regulation that was approved by the Commission exactly 1 week ago is now supported by unanimous support by member states. This is absolutely crucial because, as you know, the proposal needs to have guarantees from the member states. Second point is that the mechanism SURE will intervene on top of social protection schemes that are in place in different countries. We will not substitute these schemes. We will not include in these schemes. We will support as a sort of second line these schemes, Pulsa like Germany, Cassa Integrazione in Italy, Chômage Partiel in France, and in the other countries, knowing that this is one of the most important challenges we have in these weeks. And we are not changing the schemes, we are supporting them.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Final question, Verena Rockman from DPA.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for taking the question. Just looking back on the 3 days, maybe the obvious question, why did it take so long? And will that compromise hold, judging from the reactions that everybody's reading everything into this compromise? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I can disagree for once. It didn't take us that long. We are today deciding the 27 countries on a package of €500 billion. This did not take that long to decide. This is a package that involves 3 institutions in Europe: the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, and the ESM. This is a huge effort, a huge institutional effort, a big commitment by all member states. So I think it will hold and it will prove quite successful in fighting this crisis. Let me take the opportunity to answer also the question on the so-called, this is only a slogan, this is a title, Corona bonds. Since I am president of the Eurogroup, there's one thing that I always worked very hard to achieve, which is to not curtail the debate, but also not preempt the conclusion. I think we must be patient. This is a very important debate going to the recovery fund, going to the recovery plan. The MFF will also be involved. Again, we must build confidence around Europe. We proved to be quite successful fighting this crisis so far, and we will continue to be successful because this is what Europe needs, and this will end up in a process that increases the strength of Europe in the world, and above all for Europeans. Thank you.
Okay, that's all for today. Thanks very much to the Commissioner, to Klaus Schredding from DSM, and to President Centeno, and to all of you that participated in this press conference. Bye-bye.